Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to an MPC Online Bible Study. My name is Matthew McGlade, the lead and teaching pastor here at Mansfield Pentecostal Church. Where every Tuesday night we have our thought to think about and our question to ponder. Again, make sure if you're not part of a life group, get connected to a small group. Get 2 or 3 other people that you may be friendly with, have a good relationship with, and learn together, watch the study together, or you have the life group notes in the Sunday morning service, discuss the questions in your groups, and that way you get much more out of our time together than you just listening to me on your own. We'll continue our Bible study over these last few weeks titled The Hope of the World, and we're looking at the doctrine, the teaching of the church. And I've called it the hope of the world because the church continues the ministry and the work of Jesus here on earth after he is ascended into heaven. We've covered all sorts of aspects of church life, from the metaphors of the church, to the purity of the church, to the necessity of the church, to the purpose of the church. We've looked at the importance of the spiritual authority of the church, the relationship between the church and state and church discipline. And over the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've been looking at the church leadership, the governance of the church, the role of the apostles. There are apostles in the sense that are unique, that are no longer for today, but there are also, I believe, apostleship as a ministry to the church in leading the church forward is still, in my view, still alive today. We've looked at the importance of pastors or elders, and then last week we looked at the role of servant leaders or deacons. Now, what I want to talk about tonight is the most important qualification for leadership. If you desire to be a leader amongst God's people, let alone a leader in any other field of life, the most important thing for you to become a good leader is not your charisma, okay? Many people think that leadership is about charisma, dynamic personality, able to get things done, creativity, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, all that helps in leadership, but actually it's not the most important thing in leadership. The most important quality for you to be a leader, especially in God's house, especially amongst God's people, is character, having the right character. Because character, more than anything else, shapes the culture of an organization. If your character is good, you create a good culture. Whatever you're leading, whether it's a business or a home or a church. But if your character is bad, if there's some serious character flaws, it's going to have a negative impact upon the culture of the organization that you lead. And this is particularly important, more so in the church, given the responsibility that Jesus has given to the church to fulfill the great mandate, the great commission, in bringing the gospel to the ends of the earth. And so character is always more important than gifting. Now, in the words of John Maxwell, leadership is influence. You know, when you a good leader is someone who has influence with those around them. And a key integral part of that influence is their character. There's something about their life that others can look to and mimic and say, I'm inspired by that person. There's something about that life that I would like to have in my own life. In fact, Paul said to the Thessalonians, he says, you became imitators of us and of the Lord. In other words, Paul was saying that there was something about his life that actually served as an example for the Thessalonians to follow. In other letters, he says that, follow me as I follow Christ. That's quite a challenge for those of us who aspire to leadership, because if we hope to be leaders amongst God's people, there has to be something about our lives that actually others would be willing to follow. That's why I believe actually in church life, more than any other sphere of life, be it in business or in education or whatever other fields of leadership you could be in, actually in church life, the highest and the purest form of leadership is found there, because actually it rests mainly upon a leader's character. And so our lives, if we desire to be leaders, are to be models for others to follow. Paul would often say, he says, whatever you've learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice. I mean, that's quite audacious to think about it. Paul says, whatever you've seen from my life, put it into practice. That's something, that's a challenge to all of us here, isn't it? If we want to be leaders amongst God's people, that our lives have to be examples for others to follow. Paul encouraged Titus that in everything set an example by doing what is good. In your teaching, show integrity. And so leaders are to live their lives with integrity. They are to have character. Now, given that the essence of leadership, whether at a pastoral level or at a deacon level, isn't so much, given that the essence of leadership, I should say, isn't so much about age as it is about character and life experience. And this particularly can be seen in Paul's words to Timothy. And what I want to do tonight is I want to build on these words that Paul gives to Timothy, because I think it sets a framework of what we can do in our lives if we desire to be leaders amongst God's people. And it's not about age, it's about your character and life experience. And Paul says, don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. What I want to do is just take those 5 areas that Paul mentions and look at how can we, if we aspire to leadership amongst God's people, how can we grow in each of these areas and grow in our character so that God can prepare us for leadership in His church. And remember, there's nothing wrong in aspiring to be a leader amongst God's people. It is a good thing. It's a noble desire, and I want to encourage you to pursue that. But understand that there is sometimes a long journey that God has to take us through where He shapes our character to prepare us for leadership. Well, the first thing is this, that leaders lead an example of speech. You know, Paul often warns about the danger of destructive gossip and godless chatter in Christian community. And that's why Paul says to Timothy, turn away from godless chatter and opposing ideas of what is falsely called knowledge. And Paul was saying to Timothy, that doesn't mean you don't let things go unchecked or unsaid, especially if there's gossip or malicious things are not said that they're not being true. But it does mean that you stand against issues of gossip with a different disposition. Paul says again to Timothy that the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but must be kind to everyone, able to teach, not resentful. And so a leader amongst God's people is someone who is restrained and temperate. And when people oppose them, which happens in leadership, they don't react, they listen, and if they don't agree with what has been said, they gently instruct them. They gently respond. They're not resentful. They don't get angry. They don't get hot under the collar. With great patience, they gently instruct those who oppose them. And that is so important if you aspire to be a leader amongst God's people. Because very often, if we disagree with people, sometimes we can win the argument because we know we're right, but actually lose the relationship as a result of that. And if God's calling you to be a leader, God doesn't just want you to win the argument, He wants you to win the person as well. And leadership is about caring enough about the relationship and the truth as well. And it's walking that tightrope where you hold on to the truth, but you speak the truth, and you don't gossip, and you refute those who oppose the truth, but you do so in a way that shows respect to the individual and to where the other person is coming, because you want to win both the person and the argument. So if you aspire to leadership amongst God's people, it starts with your speech. The second thing you need to set an example is in your life or your conduct. Leaders are to live exemplary lives that others can follow. If you are married to your spouse and if you have children, the testing ground of your leadership starts firstly in your home. How you treat your spouse, how you love your wife, or how the wife responds to her husband, how you treat your children. Do the children show respect to their parents? Are there clear boundaries that are set? Because the truth is this: the home is probably the greatest and most important testing ground of leadership. Because if you're married and you have children, if you can't lead in your own home, how can you possibly lead the Church of Jesus Christ? In fact, it's not by accident that Paul talks about this, and you can read about it in 1 Timothy chapter 3, that Paul says that the home is the first testing ground, because in many ways, home life, family life, is very similar to church life. There's a lot of similarity. Both the home and church life are families. One is a natural family, the other is a spiritual family. Church is not a corporate organization. It's a spiritual family. But there still has to be, but as in the home, so as in the church, there still have to be boundaries, there still has to be organization, there still have to be procedures in place and for a home to function smoothly as in a church. And Paul is saying, actually, if a man can't lead in his home well, how can he be expected to lead God's people in the church as well? And so leadership starts in the home, and it's a good place for testing leadership. And so in the home, when you think about it, when we do life in the home, we're vulnerable, we're open. We do life, and leaders do life with people. They journey with people. Paul was often not afraid to make himself vulnerable to his readers. To the Corinthians, he says, I came to you in weakness and with great fear and trembling. So there was a sense where Paul was not afraid to be vulnerable. And the notion that somehow that familiarity breeds contempt is not true. It's actually poor character that breeds contempt. The most important thing in leadership is your character, but also that you demonstrate good character, but also that you do life with people, and that people can look at your life and see it as an example for others to follow. And so there's to be set an example in speech, in life, and in love. Leaders are to have a relational warmth and hospitality with people. And that warmth emanates out of that intense longing and love for people. Leaders are not afraid to show emotions, to show care, and to show love to those around them. Paul even shed tears with the pastors of Ephesus when he said, remember that for 3 years I never stopped warning you, each of you, night and day with tears. And that clearly had a reciprocal effect, because even the pastors, they wept over Paul when he left. And this love is likened unto a parental love. Again, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul talks about that the love that he had for the people there was like a mother to her children, or like a father to her children. And so leadership has to be motivated by love. And so that has to be the foundation of all that leaders do in terms of their character. And so leaders lead with speech, with life, with love, with faith. If you desire to be a leader, both as a servant leader in the church or as at a pastoral level, you need to have a deep grasp of the truths of the faith. Maybe that's why you're watching these Bible studies over these last few weeks, because you want to be orthodox in your theology. You want to have a good grasp of the deep truths of the Christian message. And the reason for that is because as a leader, you need to be able to gently correct error. So when something has been said that is wrong, you need, with respect to that individual, you need to be very, very gently correct it and say, I'm sorry, but actually maybe you've not seen this. In fact, I'm sorry, actually the Bible says this, and you need to be able to do that. Paul says that he must hold firmly, speaking of the pastor of the church, he must hold firmly to the trustworthy message as it has been taught, so that he can encourage others by sound doctrine and refute those who oppose it. So perhaps that's why one of the reason why Paul in his letter says that leaders should not be recent converts, because They're not yet grounded enough. They haven't had sufficient time to be grounded in the faith. And there's always a danger, Paul says, that they could be conceited, and that would therefore very severely limit the potential of the church. And so we looked at 4 things that we as leaders are to set an example in our speech, in our life. We're to do life with people. Remember, it's not familiarity that breeds content, it's poor character. We are to love people. We're to demonstrate faith. We have to grasp a good hold of the faith that's been entrusted to us. But the final area that leaders set the example is in purity. Leaders are to have integrity. The word integrity derives from the word integer, which means wholeness. We are to be whole in how we live our lives. We are to be blameless in how we live our lives. We are to love what is good. We are to be moderate in our appetites, and what we eat and what we drink. We are to be devoted to our spouses. I mentioned earlier on that in Paul's letter to Timothy in 1 Timothy 1, that the elder or the pastor of the church is to be a one-woman man, devoted to their spouse. They are to be upright, they're to be holy, they live disciplined lives, they keep their temperament and their theology under check. They are worthy, the Bible says, of double honor if they do their job well, but even so, they need to be careful that they watch their motives so that they do not stray into financial gain. And that's one of the biggest pitfalls of leadership, is financial gain, greed for money. And so these are things that are crucial for leadership. It needs to be pure. And so as we just close this session tonight, guys, I want to thank you for listening and putting up with me up to this point. I just want to say that character is the most important quality of leadership. Everything rises and falls, in my view, at character. Character takes a lifetime to build, and it takes a lot, and it's the only thing, the most important thing that is required to build trust. And where character fails, trust is lost in an instant. And so if you aspire to be a leader amongst God's people, understand the importance of your character. It affects, if God calls you into pastoral leadership, it affects your teaching of God's word. Your character does. It is essential for moral authority, where your words and your actions need to marry together. So you can't engender trust amongst God's people if there's no character. It is essential also for the witness of the church in the wider community for the progress of the gospel. And scholars have actually shown that the character qualities that Paul labels and lists in 1 Timothy chapter 3 were not leadership qualities that were of the highest value for those within the church, but also wider culture also valued those character qualities. Generals, doctors, rulers in the wider culture were expected to live their lives by a high character. And as Christians, we are to live our lives by the standard of character that God has set for us. And we are to be examples to those who don't know Christ, because it is our character that is a significant starting point when we're reaching out into the community. And it's especially important for those who aspire to be leaders, whether as deacons or servant leaders in the church or as pastors, because the gospel of Christ has been discredited. When we think of scandals amongst leaders of the church in the past, things that have gone wrong and the damage that has done to the message of the gospel. And so character is of such importance. Guys, thanks for listening to me tonight. Hope you've got something out of that. That is our thought to think about. A question to ponder. I'd like you to discuss this question within your life groups. Of the 5 areas of leadership examples: speech, life, love, faith, and purity, which area do you feel you need to grow in to be a better leader? So the 5 areas of leadership examples: speech, life, love, faith, and purity. Which area do you feel you need to grow in to be a better leader. And the text of study, I'd like you to read 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 to 12. And as you read that text together in your group, I'd like you to ask this question: in what ways are the qualifications of an elder or a pastor similar to that of a deacon? In what ways are the qualifications of an elder or a pastor similar to that of a deacon? Thanks for listening tonight, guys. Listen, have a great rest of the evening, great rest of the week. Hope to see you on Sunday. God bless you all.